Please support your festival by purchasing from our beverage and merchandise booths. Do your part to keep the festival clean by using trash and recycling containers on site. And please enjoy responsibly. Special thanks to the Satchmo Legacy Stage contributors, Harrah's New Orleans, Joseph K. and Inez Eichenbaum Foundation, Ella Fitzgerald Charitable Foundation, the Fertel Foundation, Leslie Alley, Richie and Vicky Norwegian, and Andrea Duplessis. And thank you to all our festival sponsors, including Chevron, Omni Royal Orleans, Abita Brewing Company, Brown Forman, Fidelity Bank, GE Digital, WWL TV, Offbeat Magazine, NOLA.com, Times-Picayune, and many more. Be sure to visit our outdoor stages, the Abita Beer Garden, and our festival food vendors. Pick up a schedule for a full listing of all events, and stop by the merchandise tent to purchase the official Satchmo Summerfest poster, shirts, and souvenirs. Enjoy the 18th annual Satchmo Summerfest, presented by Chevron. And happy birthday, Louis Armstrong.
And given today is actually his baptismal certificate birthday, happy birthday, Louis Armstrong. All right, again, thank you for coming to the 18th annual Satchmo Summerfest and coming to the Satchmo Legacy Stage. We have all sorts of great speakers and things to be talked about going along. Right now, one of the best is coming up. Mr. Sascha Feinstein will be talking about pops and poetry and giving a reading of some poetry inspired by and about Louis Armstrong. He also publishes a journal called Brilliant Corners, which is a fantastic name for any kind of jazz-involved thing. That will be for sale. You'll be selling copies out. We sell outside the doors, on the tables right over there. So give a warm welcome, Sascha Feinstein.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for coming. I really mean that. Poets, whether they're lecturing or reading, aren't used to looking at seats that actually have people in them. There's a reason Phil Woods once told a buddy of mine, "I love you poets, man, because you're the only cats who make less money than we do." I'm going to be speaking about depictions of Louis Armstrong in poetry, and I'd like to begin with a ridiculously obvious statement that I know we can all agree upon. Louis Armstrong was, quite simply, one of the greatest innovators of jazz, and some would argue the greatest innovator. In this setting, I think I can speak without fear of contradiction, you know. And while I'm not a fan of such canonical lists, perhaps we can also agree that Duke Ellington would be on it, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane. I would include Thelonious Monk. Among the vocalists, Billie Holiday. Their position in this jazz pantheon is, unlike our current president, fairly unimpeachable. Now, if we look at the attention paid to them in poetry, the numbers of poems influenced by those giants, Coltrane and Bird probably come in first. Monk is not too far behind, then Billy, Duke is a distant fifth, and Louis is probably last. Why is that? Is it because poets are not aware of his genius? No. Is it because pops wax more commercially successful albums? Maybe, I'm not sure. But I can speak with certainty about a couple of general but important truths. First, although poets began writing about jazz in the 20s and 30s, most notably Langston Hughes and Sterling Brown, the sheer volume of jazz-related poetry escalated exponentially after the death of Charlie Parker in 1955. And by the late 50s, it had become an actual fad, for better or for worse. And the idea of being hip had everything to do with being contemporary, and given the propulsive speed of jazz history, Armstrong's innovations seemed extremely out of date to bebop-focused hipsters. Second, I think we must acknowledge that poets, very generally speaking, groove on hardship. The late William Matthews, a poet who knew jazz very well and wrote about it brilliantly, once dubbed poetry readings stand-up tragedy. I believe if Dizzy Gillespie had died at 34 and Bird had lived to be 75, we'd have thousands more poems for Diz. Coltrane's sound, and yes, his premature death, became the musical embodiment of the Black Arts movement. Poets adopted his legacy as a podium for their passionate political agendas. Thelonious Monk's eccentricities have been the focus of poems, many more poems than his music. And Billie Holiday's tragic life has fueled more verse than her vocals. In 1996, I founded Brilliant Corners, a journal of jazz and literature, which I still edit. And I have read so many submissions that focus on tragedy. The car crashes that took the lives of Scott LaFaro and Clifford Brown, the assassination of Lee Morgan at Slugs. Get the irony, right? The innumerable heroin deaths, Chet Baker tumbling from his hotel window, and so on. But those artists who lived lengthier lives, and especially those jazz musicians not associated with the seedier aspects of the world, tend to receive much less attention. Poets dig tragedy, man. And Pops, for all of his hardship and for all of the prejudicial experiences that he wallowed through and outmuscled, is largely remembered on superficial but commonplace levels as an amiable performer. And I think that's why, by comparison, he has not been celebrated in poetry as frequently as he should be. That said, there are scores of fabulous exceptions. And what I'd like to celebrate today is exactly that. The compilation could hardly be more varied. I'm not going to propose some kind of tight-assed academic thesis that unifies the image of Louis Armstrong in verse. No. Just as his music influenced innumerable international social classes, so has his imprint in poetry varied in the extreme. More than anything, I'd like you to sit back and hear some lines of poetry that I hope will be fresh and engaging. I want this to be just as much of a reading as a lecture. But I'd like to make some observations along the way that might help you digest the lines. And let's begin with imagery, since Louis Armstrong is probably the most iconic figure in jazz. I mean, the guy at my summer house helps me take down enormous trees, probably has never heard of most jazz musicians, but I suspect even he has a mental image of Louis Armstrong. It's more likely that than not that any layman doesn't know quite as much as, say, Ricky Riccardi. But there's an iconic image that instantly comes to mind, right? And in poetry, that's a great aid, because as a writer, you then don't need to fill in the necessary background info, the way you would, say, if you were talking about an uncle in a family or a so-called minor artist whose name does not conjure general recognition. Mention Louis Armstrong, and you've immediately created tangible imagery that engages the reader. Even a brief anecdote becomes fully satisfying, as with Samuel Allen's poem, I Say, Mr. A., which I'll read in its entirety. When, at the close of war, Louis Armstrong returned to the continent, the gentlemen of the press crowded about, inquiring, I say, Mr. Armstrong, which reception did you feel was warmer, that before the war or this? And Mr. Armstrong replied to the gentlemen, saying, I didn't have no thermometer, but they was both a bitch. The line is good, right? But the line becomes great because we know so much about the person who delivered it, right? If it had been a story about my uncle, you wouldn't have responded nearly as dramatically, Conversely, and ironically, such global recognition also creates problems for writers. Somehow, they need to reach beyond the icon, creating portraiture that is unexpected. And how do you celebrate genius, true genius, without becoming overblown with praise? Not so easy. The Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, in his poem Satchmo, translated by Albert C. Todd, imagines Armstrong in heaven and concludes, let the good times roll once more, shake up that boring state of little angels. But so there'll be no remorse in hell, so death will cheer us sinners up. Archangel Gabriel, pass your horn to the better player, to Louis. Similarly, the innovative poet Melvin Tolson wrote in his book Harlem Gallery, if I climbed the 77 steps of the seventh heaven, Satchmo's high C would carry me higher. Are you hip to this, Harlem? Are you hip? On Judgment Day, Gabriel will say after he blows his horn, I'd be the greatest trumpeter in the universe if old Satchmo had never been born. This, I suppose, is the pinnacle of hagiographic praise. But where's the middle ground between mortal and immortal? Dave Smith has a poem with the lengthy title, Louis Armstrong and the Astronauts Meet at the Langley AFB Pool. And immediately we're interested, right? Because the extremes of fame unite in this unexpected setting. The poet and translator Paul Blackburn, in what may well have been his final poem, invokes Louis Armstrong in a strange dance of death. What a gas! Maybe Louis Armstrong and I die, back to back, cheek to cheek, maybe the same year. Oh, I can't give you anything but love, baby. 1926, okay, a label then, black and gold print, was one of my folks' favorite tunes that year that I was born. It is all still true, and Louis gone down, and I, oh mama, going down that same road, damn fast. Gerald Early, much better known for his critical prose, has a poem called Swing to the Many that's subtitled A Tale of Louis Armstrong and His Valet. And of course we want to know about the valet exclusively because he's privy to privacy and witnesses the legendary trumpeter not from afar, shimmering on a glamorous stage, say, but, quote, head-ragged and robed, tired, plopping as he sat and stared and sat and frowned. The poem concludes, and so his valet touchingly looked at Pops, as if in some exquisite gratitude, but only to say, sir, as if that soft utterance of servitude, of rendering up to please, would be like applause ringing in his master's ears. Similarly, the New Orleans poet Tom Dent writes in his poem for Little Louis, Louis, I'm trying to understand what you were really like in the dark moments away from the stage. Dent wants to know the unknowable, the secrets Armstrong died keeping, but acknowledges the impossibility of such a desire. Dent's poem ends with a gesture much like Bird Lives, breaking the trumpeter's first name with a slash, Lou is. And that sensibility of legacy drives the poem Louis by another New Orleans writer, Lee Grew, a poet whose writing and life celebrates New Orleans for being as alive in its ghostly torn-down past as it is in its present. I'll read the whole piece. Louis, aren't you tired of playing possum? The trouble with your public is they don't want to let you be. Here you lie down to rest your eyes, and they go off saying you're dead. Write tributes, erect statues, make up festivals, all in your good name. Thank God they do. You're employing a bunch of New Orleans musicians, artists, and poets who need the money. But does your audience realize music is liquid? Unlike blood, keeps on flowing no matter what happens to the body. 40 years ago, my mother, who heard you in Uganda, said people streamed for miles following the drums to Kampala just to hear his horn. Louis Armstrong made me cry for home. As much as some of us don't always like what's going on at home, New Orleans is in the marrow of our bones. No matter where we go, we carry New Orleans with us. So, Louis, it doesn't matter if you want to be buried here or not. We belong to you and you to us. Our musicians honor you. If you don't believe me, go listen to Kermit at Vaughn's every night, Thursday night, right by my house. The earliest poem for Pops that I know of was not written by an American, but by a Belgian poet and playwright, Ernst Mowerman. His poem, titled Louis Armstrong, first appeared in 1933 and was then translated in 1934 by Samuel Beckett. Pretty cool, right? You know, it's extremely impressionistic with snippets of song titles that coax avant-garde imagery. Some of these days, muffled in ooze, drown, down, 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 pang of white in my hair. After you've gone, Narcissus, lean and slippered. You're driving me crazy, and the trumpet is old bull, its chassis aghast out of the throes of morning. The abstract poem builds until the speaker feels physically and spiritually transcended. His she-notes, they have more tentacles than the sea. They woo me, they close my eyes, they suck me out of the world. It's the kind of gesture that also ends the poem For Louis Armstrong, A Juju, by Sarah Webster Fabio, a figure from the Black Arts movement of the 60s. St. Louis, Louis, you gotta go now. Blow on out of this world. Fabio's tribute is propelled by repetition that frankly works a bit better in the air than on the page, and indirectly raises an important question about jazz and poetry. If language can only aspire to be music, how can poetry evoke the spirit of jazz? One way is through metaphor and synesthesia, and this brings to mind the poem Louis Armstrong by the Japanese-American poet Lawson Fuseo Inada. It begins, Pops's place is one great kitchen, and for 2.5 pages leans on metaphor to create a whimsical, aroma-filled journey. In Pops's place, the savor is always strong. This is how the chicory coffee steeps and brews. The seasonings season to belong. If you ain't sweaty, the sauce ain't ready. When Pops stews the blues, quote, the exuberance boils over. His pots and pans and lids become timpani and percussion. Inada brings his homage to a conclusion by inviting us all to partake in this nourishing, life-sustaining art. Pops is calling and calling you. Pops is proclaiming the table set. Pops is saying, don't be late. Yes, all roads parade to Pops's place for you to follow on home. One of the better-known poems for Armstrong is The Highest Wind That Ever Blew, Homage to Louis, by Fred Chappell, the former poet laureate of North Carolina. Birthday morning, I put the record on, says the speaker. Hot 5, hot damn. What a way to never grow old. I couldn't count how many times you saved my life. And later in the poem, Chappell introduces an italicized question, what's whiskey without the jazz? And answers it with improvisatory hipness. Nothing but gut ache, nothing to look back on. Whiskey alone don't fill you that honeysuckle sunlight in your vein. It ain't the gin that makes you shine. It's the man in the cyclone of flame who keeps on saying yes with a note that would light up the ice ages. He's the silver sunrise in the pit of the body, dawn wind jiving the trees. Thoreau was right. Morning is moral reform. Give me a shot. And please play West End blues. I need to hear the wistful whippoorwill, to hear the railroad ties hauling the lovers as they walk down the line with 19 bottles of whiskey in each hand, going to meet the woman and hear the man. One of my favorite poems for Pops was written by Pulitzer Prize winner Yusef Komunyakaa, Satchmo, USA, from his book Taboo. It begins like a letter a letter to a heroic mentor and courses through the trumpeter's personal and artistic odyssey. Dear Mr. Satchmo, I'm on the other side with Tiger Rag and way down yonder in New Orleans on the turntable, a heart drawn on the soles of my feet. Here in the inner sanctum, I see you toting buckets of coal to Storyville's red light houses. You are a small figure raising a pistol to fire at God in the night sky. But when I turn to look out at the evening star, your face is mine. You are holding a bugle in your first cutting contest with fate. Komunyaka's narrative meanders through Armstrong's career, never shying away from political truths, but presenting them through profoundly compressed metaphor. In a corner of the naked eye, your smile isn't a smile. Confessions and curses drip from your trumpet, and notes about the FBI dogging your footsteps since '48 float like ghosts of reefer smoke in an alley. Ike wanted you to change your words about Little Rock as you wove hex signs into Indiana and Sleepy down south. By the time the bomb in Memphis settled into your mind, you were already back in Corona blowing triplets for 3 or 4 boys sitting on your front steps. If you and your drummer couldn't play on the same stage, New Orleans was only a bronze statue in a park. Satchmo, I believe in your horn. A couple of still more recent Armstrong poems appear in the 2017 issue of Brilliant Corners, which also features an interview with the great Mick Carlin, who will be speaking here tomorrow. A self-serving plug, I've got copies of these on sale afterwards at an unbelievable discount. I mean, just, you should buy 20 or 30 of them. The lengthier of the two poems is by Joshua Michael Stewart. It's an ambitious 8-sectioned poem titled Impressions of Louis Armstrong and dedicated to Ricky Riccardi and based on the tremendous work that Ricky has done. And that spans from the 1920s all the way to Armstrong's death. I really encourage you to read it, but you got to buy the book, man. The other piece is by Richard Jackson and takes place in Slovenia, with the speaker listening to a jazz ensemble performing their signature tune, My Bucket's Got a Hole in It. And then, with great deftness, he transitions to Armstrong's lasting, necessary influence. Maybe it really is the music of the spheres that holds us all together. Maybe those swallows circling the outside patio really are arranging themselves as notes arriving from another age. So it seems it is also 25 years ago, another side of town, listening to the bar's crackling speakers, voice Louis Armstrong's relaxed phrasings on Bucket, which seems to hold the exploding world together just south of here. Jack Teagarden's trombone sliding with Earl Hines's trumpeting piano over each atrocity, not to blot them out, but to provide some hope. So it seems the day gives way, nothing it needs to keep being the day. So it seems for the couples rising now to dance as the quarter's trumpet calls them to the floor. Even those swallows around the patio seem to be keeping time, though we know it can't be kept. And now the band responds by shifting into swing. It is not enough to understand this life if you only live it once. By pulling us back to the present, Jackson suggests the trenchant legacy of Armstrong. What you hear in this poem, as with the majority for Louis Armstrong, is the voice of gratitude. Thanks for coming tonight.
Sascha Feinstein, y'all. One more time. Not easy to get up and do that just with your voice. He will be selling copies of Brilliant Corners outside as soon as he can make his way over there, I suppose. That was some brilliant stuff. That made me think about Louis Armstrong in a very different light. So, anyway, we will be back in a few minutes with Jerry Roche and Ricky Riccardi, who are an always entertaining team, talking about the Dot Time Records recordings of Louis Armstrong's Legacy series. So go grab yourself something to eat and drink and come on back in a few minutes. All right, thanks.